A flashing red and blue light in the rearview mirror is usually just the sign of a ruined evening and a heavy fine. But for Officer Mitchell Brody, pulling over a black man in a pristine vintage muscle car wasn't just a routine traffic stop. It was an ego trip. He thought he was unmasking a fraud, a street thug playing dress-up in a military uniform. He had no idea the man in handcuffs was a highly decorated two-star major general. By the time the Pentagon made their phone call, Brody's career and his entire precinct were already up in flames. The heavy, humid air of a Virginia July hung low over the affluent, manicured streets of Oak Ridge. It was a town that prided itself on its quiet exclusivity, a sprawling suburban haven just far enough from the chaotic political heartbeat of Washington, D.C. to feel like a retreat, but close enough for the capital's elite to commute. Major General Arthur Harrison was tired. At 58 years old, his body had endured 3 combat deployments, countless jumps out of perfectly good airplanes, and the kind of bureaucratic warfare in the Pentagon that was often more exhausting than the physical battlefields of Afghanistan. Arthur was a 32-year veteran of the United States Army. His hair was cropped close to his scalp, peppered heavily with silver at the temples, and his posture, even when seated behind the wheel of a car, was rigidly upright, a permanent byproduct of decades of discipline. He was driving his pride and joy, a fully restored, midnight blue 1969 Chevrolet Chevelle SS. The deep, guttural rumble of the engine was a stark contrast to the quiet electric vehicles that usually populated the streets of Oak Ridge. Arthur was on his way home to his wife, Helen, after a grueling 14-hour session in the Situation Room. He was still wearing his OCPs, the standard-issue operational camouflage pattern uniform of the Army. The twin black stars of a major general rested squarely on the center of his chest. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't swerving. He was driving exactly 3 miles under the 45-mile-per-hour speed limit, his mind completely preoccupied with a logistics crisis involving NATO troop movements in Eastern Europe. 2 miles behind him, hidden in the shadow of a sprawling oak tree near an intersection, sat Oak Ridge Police Cruiser 42. Inside the cruiser were Officer Mitchell Brody and his rookie partner, Officer Liam Higgins. Brody was a 12-year veteran of the force, a man whose ambition vastly outpaced his intelligence. He was notorious in the department for his aggressive tactics and a deeply ingrained, barely concealed prejudice that he masked as proactive policing. He was a man who peaked in high school, harboring a bitter resentment toward anyone he perceived as having unearned status or wealth. Higgins, on the other hand, was only 6 months out of the academy. He was nervous, eager to please, and deeply intimidated by Brody's dominant, bullying personality. As the Chevelle rumbled past their hiding spot, Brody's eyes locked onto the vehicle. "Look at this guy," Brody sneered, tapping the steering wheel. "Classic Chevelle, flawless paint job, easily $100,000 car." Higgins squinted through the windshield. "It's a beauty. Looks like he's driving the speed limit, too." "Yeah, well, people who drive cars like that around here don't usually look like him," Brody muttered, shifting the cruiser into drive. "Like what?" Higgins asked, genuinely confused. "Like they don't belong in this zip code," Brody snapped. He pulled out onto the main road, the cruiser's engine whining as he accelerated to close the gap between them and the classic muscle car. Arthur saw the headlights rapidly approaching in his rearview mirror. He didn't panic. He checked his speedometer. 42 miles per hour. He checked his lane positioning. Perfect. He assumed the officer was responding to a call and would pass him. Instead, the cruiser aggressively tailgated the Chevelle for an agonizingly long 1/4 of a mile. Brody was running the plates. "Plates come back clean," Higgins noted, looking at the glowing laptop terminal between them. "Registered to an Arthur Harrison. Address is in the gated community over on Westbourne." Brody frowned, his jaw ticking. He didn't like it when his instincts were challenged by facts. "Tint looks a little dark. And did you see him drift the center line?" "I didn't see him drift," Higgins said softly. "He drifted. Turn on the cherries," Brody commanded. Higgins hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching over and flicking the toggle. The light bar atop the cruiser exploded into a blinding display of red and blue flashes. The siren gave a short, authoritative whoop. Arthur let out a long, heavy sigh. The fatigue deep in his bones seemed to double in weight. He checked his mirrors, signaled his intent, and smoothly pulled the Chevelle onto the wide shoulder of the road, placing the vehicle exactly in the center of the breakdown lane to give the officers plenty of room to approach safely. He turned off the engine, plunging the cabin into silence, rolled down all 4 windows, a courtesy he had learned years ago, and placed both of his large, calloused hands firmly at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. He waited. He had nothing to hide, but as a black man in America, even one with 2 stars on his chest, he knew the unspoken rules of this interaction. Keep your hands visible. Move slowly. Speak calmly. In the cruiser, Brody killed the siren and unbuckled his seatbelt. "All right, rookie, let's see what kind of drug money bought this piece of classic Detroit steel." "Mitch, he didn't do anything," Higgins whispered, feeling a knot form in his stomach. He crossed the yellow line. "Higgins, you need to get your eyes checked," Brody replied, unstrapping the retention holster of his service weapon. A completely unnecessary escalation for a traffic stop. Brody stepped out of the cruiser, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. He approached the Chevelle with a practiced, predatory swagger. He didn't walk to the driver's window immediately. Instead, he stopped at the rear quarter panel, placing a heavy hand on the pristine trunk, leaving a visible smudge on the wax before slowly moving forward. Arthur watched him in the side mirror. He noted the unclasped holster. The general's analytical mind, trained to assess threats in fractions of a second, immediately categorized Officer Brody. Aggressive, overcompensating, dangerous. Brody finally arrived at the driver's side window. He shone his heavy mag light directly into Arthur's face, nearly blinding him, despite the fact that the streetlights provided more than enough illumination. "Evening," Arthur said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone, perfectly calm and devoid of intimidation. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Brody barked, leaning in close, keeping the blinding beam of the flashlight focused directly on Arthur's eyes. "They are in my wallet, in my back right pocket, and the registration is in the glove compartment. I am going to reach for them now," Arthur stated clearly, narrating his movements. "Just get them," Brody snapped. Arthur moved with deliberate slowness. He retrieved his wallet and pulled out his Virginia driver's license. Then, anticipating the usual routine, he also pulled out his CAC, his Department of Defense Common Access card. He handed both cards, along with the registration, through the open window. Brody snatched the cards from Arthur's hand. He lowered the flashlight slightly, shining it onto the documents. He read the driver's license first. Arthur Harrison. Then, Brody looked at the military ID. He stared at it. He looked at the uniform Arthur was wearing, taking in the camouflage pattern, the U.S. Army name tape, and finally, the black rank insignia stitched into the center of his chest. 2 stars. A smirk slowly spread across Brody's face. It was an ugly, triumphant expression. He let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Major General, huh?" Brody said, his voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. "That is correct, officer," Arthur replied, his face completely impassive. Brody stepped back to half-pace, resting his hand casually on the grip of his firearm. "You expect me to believe that you—" He gestured vaguely at Arthur with the flashlight. "Are a 2-star general in the United States Army." "I don't expect you to believe anything, officer," Arthur said, his tone cooling to a glacial chill. "I expect you to run my information through your system, write me a citation if you feel I have committed a moving violation, and allow me to proceed to my home." Officer Liam Higgins stood awkwardly near the rear bumper of the Chevelle, watching the interaction. He couldn't hear every word, but he could hear the mocking tone in his partner's voice, and it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He took a hesitant step forward. Brody leaned back into the window, his face now inches from Arthur's. The officer smelled of stale coffee and cheap spearmint gum. "Here's what I think, Artie," Brody said, deliberately disrespecting the man's rank and name. "I think you bought this car with money that isn't exactly legal. I think you bought these clothes at an army surplus store to try and look respectable. And I think this little plastic card here is a cheap fake you printed off the internet so you could try and hustle military discounts at the local hardware store." Arthur did not blink. The sheer audacity of the accusation didn't anger him. It fascinated him in a grim, clinical way. He had led thousands of troops into combat. He had briefed the President of the United States. And now, a small-town beat cop was calling him a fraud on the side of a Virginia highway. "Officer," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the distinct, heavy weight of command authority. "I strongly advise you to take a step back, return to your vehicle and contact your dispatch. Have them run my DoD identification number. If you continue down this path, you are going to make a profound mistake that will permanently alter the trajectory of your career." It was the wrong thing to say to a man like Brody. Brody didn't hear a warning. He heard a challenge to his authority. He heard disrespect. Brody's face flushed a deep, angry red. "Are you threatening me, boy?" Arthur's eyes narrowed infinitesimally. The word boy hung in the humid air, heavy and loaded with generations of poison. "I am stating a fact," Arthur replied, his voice dangerously quiet. "Run the card." "Step out of the vehicle!" Brody suddenly roared, taking a wide stance and drawing his weapon halfway out of its holster. "Step out of the vehicle right now!" Higgins jumped, his hand instinctively flying to his own weapon. "Mitch, what's going on?" he yelled. "We got a 10-15 situation. Suspect is non-compliant and impersonating a federal officer. Get out of the car!" Brody screamed, fully unholstering his weapon and pointing it downward, just inches from the door panel. Arthur looked at the gun, then back to Brody's hyperventilating face. The general knew exactly how quickly situations like this devolved into tragedy. A panicked, poorly trained officer with a gun was vastly more dangerous than an enemy combatant. "I'm turning off the battery," Arthur said calmly. "I am unbuckling my seatbelt. My hands are empty. I am opening the door." Arthur moved with absolute precision. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped out onto the asphalt. At 6'3" and 220 pounds of solid muscle, Arthur towered over the 5'9" Brody. As Arthur stood to his full height, the physical disparity seemed to instantly terrify the officer. "Turn around, put your hands on the roof of the car, interlace your fingers," Brody shouted, his voice cracking slightly with adrenaline. Arthur complied silently. He turned away from the officers, placed his large hands flat on the cool, dew-covered roof of the Chevelle, and interlaced his fingers. Brody practically lunged at him. He grabbed Arthur's left wrist, twisting it violently behind his back. The pain was sharp, but Arthur had endured interrogations in SEER school that made this feel like a massage. He didn't make a sound. Brody slapped a heavy steel handcuff onto Arthur's left wrist, ratcheting it down so tightly it instantly bit into the skin and cut off the circulation. He violently yanked Arthur's right arm back and secured the second cuff. "You have the right to remain silent," Brody barked, pressing his forearm aggressively into the center of Arthur's spine, right over the 2 stars. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Higgins stood frozen, watching his training officer manhandle a man who was offering absolutely zero resistance. "Mitch," Higgins stammered. "Mitch, what is the charge?" "Impersonating a military officer, forgery, fraud, resisting arrest," Brody rattled off, breathing heavily. He began to roughly pat down Arthur's pockets, aggressively grabbing at the fabric of the OCP trousers. "I did not resist," Arthur stated calmly to the roof of his car. "Shut up!" Brody yelled, shoving Arthur forward so his chest slammed against the roof of the Chevelle. "You're a fake, a pathetic, lying fake. Stolen valor is a federal offense, buddy. You're looking at federal prison." "Higgins," Arthur said, turning his head slightly to look at the rookie. "Your name is Higgins, correct? It's on your badge." Higgins swallowed hard, nodding slowly. Yes, sir. Higgins, you need to call your watch commander. Now, before your partner does irreparable damage," Arthur said, his voice surprisingly gentle, like a father giving instructions to a confused child. "Don't you talk to him!" Brody snarled, grabbing Arthur by the back of his collar and violently yanking him away from the car. "You talk to me! You're going to jail, fake general! Let's see how tough you are when you're sitting in a holding cell with real criminals." Brody frog-marched Arthur toward the police cruiser. As they walked, a few cars passed by, slowing down to gawk at the spectacle. An older white couple in a Volvo stared wide-eyed as they saw a black man in military fatigues being shoved into the back of a police car. Arthur felt the sting of public humiliation, a deep, burning indignation, but he kept his face a mask of stone. Brody shoved Arthur down into the cramped back seat of the cruiser. Because of Arthur's broad shoulders and the tight handcuffs, he had to sit hunched forward at a painful angle. Brody slammed the door shut with excessive force. Brody walked back to the Chevelle and tossed Arthur's keys to Higgins. "Call a tow truck. Have this piece of junk impounded." Higgins caught the keys, looking sick to his stomach. "Mitch." I looked at his ID. "It has a microchip. It has the holograms. It looks completely real. What if he actually is a major general?" Brody laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed in the quiet suburban street. "Are you kidding me, Liam? Look at the guy. Does he look like he commands a division of the US Army? He's a thug who figured out how to print a fancy card. We're doing the country a favor. Get the tow truck." Brody climbed into the driver's seat of the cruiser. He glanced at Arthur through the heavy plexiglass partition. "You're going away for a long time, Artie," Brody gloated, putting the car in drive. Arthur looked back at him, his dark eyes entirely devoid of fear. "Officer Brody," Arthur said smoothly, "I hope, for your sake, you don't have a mortgage, because by tomorrow morning you will be unemployed." Brody just laughed and hit the gas. The Oak Ridge Police Department was a small, brutally mundane concrete building built in the late 1980s. It smelled perpetually of cheap pine cleaner, stale sweat, and burnt coffee. As Brody dragged Arthur through the sliding glass doors into the processing area, the few officers present paused what they were doing to watch. Arthur's posture remained impeccable, even with his hands bound tightly behind his back. The steel cuffs were cutting deeply into his wrists, but he walked with the measured, terrifying calm of a man who was completely in control of a situation everyone else mistakenly thought they commanded. Behind the high booking desk sat Desk Sergeant Thomas Keller. Keller was a 20-year veteran, a man counting down the days until his pension kicked in. He was tired, perpetually irritated, and possessed a deeply ingrained cynicism regarding his fellow officers, especially Mitchell Brody. "What do we have here, Brody?" Keller asked, adjusting his reading glasses as he looked over the desk at the towering figure of Arthur Harrison. Keller's eyes immediately locked onto the camouflage uniform and the two black stars. A subtle frown creased his forehead. "Caught a live one, Sarge." Brody beamed, practically vibrating with arrogant pride. "Got him on a traffic violation. Found out he's impersonating a military officer. Total fraud, trying to pass himself off as a major general." Brody tossed Arthur's wallet, driver's license, and DoD ID onto the high desk. Keller picked up the DoD Common Access card. He held it up to the fluorescent light. He tilted it, watching the intricate holographic eagle shimmer and shift. He flipped it over, noting the magnetic strip and the gold microchip. Keller had served 4 years in the Marines back in the early 90s. He knew what military IDs looked like. And while the technology had advanced significantly since his time, the weight and quality of the card in his hand felt unnervingly authentic. Keller looked from the card to Arthur. He noted the man's bearing, the sharpness of his haircut, the absolute absence of panic. "Name?" Keller asked, his tone neutral, addressing Arthur directly. "Arthur Harrison, Major General, United States Army," Arthur replied, his voice echoing slightly in the sterile concrete room. Brody scoffed loudly. "Give it a rest, Artie. The show's over." Keller shot Brody a withering glare. Shut up, Mitch." Keller turned back to his computer terminal. "Brody, take him to holding cell 3 and take the cuffs off. I'm going to run this through the system." "Sarge, he was non-compliant." Brody started to protest. "Take the cuffs off, put him in the cell, and bring me the intake form," Keller ordered, his voice brooking no argument. Brody scowled, grabbing Arthur's arm and shoving him toward the holding area. "Let's go, Faker." The holding area was a short corridor, lined with 3 barred cells. Cells 1 and 2 were empty. Brody unlocked cell 3, shoved Arthur inside, and roughly unlocked the handcuffs. Arthur brought his arms forward, rubbing the deep red indentations on his wrists. He didn't say a word as Brody slammed the heavy iron door shut, the lock engaging with a loud, final clank. "Make yourself comfortable, General," Brody sneered through the bars. "I hear the federal pen serves great powdered eggs." Brody turned and walked away. Arthur stood in the center of the small, foul-smelling cell. There was a metal bench bolted to the wall and a stainless steel toilet in the corner. He did not sit. He walked to the bars, wrapped his hands around the cold steel, and waited. Out at the booking desk, Sergeant Keller was typing furiously. He ran Arthur's Virginia driver's license first. It came back immediately. Arthur Harrison, age 58. Clean record. No warrants. Registered to an address in Westbourne Estates. Keller swallowed hard. Westbourne Estates was the most expensive neighborhood in the county. Houses there didn't go for less than $3 million. Next, Keller tried to run the DoD ID number through the NCIC, National Crime Information Center, database. The system stalled. A loading wheel spun on the screen for what felt like an eternity. Standard police databases do not have direct, open access to high-level Pentagon personnel files. When a local cop runs a standard military ID, it usually confirms basic active duty status. But when a local cop runs the ID of a flag officer holding top-secret SCI clearance, the system initiates a flag. The screen suddenly flashed a bright, solid yellow. "Clearance required, restricted file, Contact Department of Defense. Liaison Office for verification." Keller leaned back in his chair, a cold drop of sweat trickling down his spine. He looked at the yellow screen, then looked down the hall toward the holding cells. Brody strutted back to the desk, tossing a blank intake form onto the counter. "So, what did it say, Sarge? Did he print it at FedEx or Kinko's?" Keller looked at Brody. For the first time in a decade, Keller felt genuine terror. "Brody, the system flagged it. It's restricted." Brody rolled his eyes. Yeah, because it's a fake number, Sarge. It's confusing the computer. Book him. I want to go home. It doesn't say invalid, Keller whispered, pointing a shaky finger at the screen. It says restricted. Brody, if this guy is who this card says he is, you didn't just arrest a soldier. You arrested a general. He's a fake. Brody slammed his hand on the desk, his voice rising in panic and anger. Look at him, Thomas. Does he look like a general to you? What does a general look like, Mitch? Keller snapped back. Before Brody could answer, a loud, clear voice echoed down the concrete hallway from cell 3. Sergeant! Arthur called out, his voice cutting through the tension like a hot knife. By law, I am entitled to a telephone call upon being detained. I would like to make that call now. Keller stood up, slowly. He grabbed the cordless phone from its cradle on the desk. He walked past Brody, ignoring the younger officer's protests, and approached cell 3. Keller looked through the bars at Arthur. The man was standing perfectly still, his posture radiating authority. Keller felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to salute. Who do you want to call, Mr. Harrison? Keller asked, trying to keep his voice steady. A lawyer? Your wife? Neither, Arthur said quietly. He reached through the bars and took the phone from Keller's trembling hand. Arthur dialed a number from memory. It was not a local 703 area code. It was a secure, unlisted number that routed directly through an encrypted switchboard in Arlington, Virginia. Brody had followed Keller down the hall. He stood behind the sergeant, a smug look plastered across his face. Who's he calling? The fake president? Brody chuckled. Arthur ignored him. He held the phone to his ear. It rang twice. Then, a crisp, professional voice answered on the other end. National Military Command Center, Senior Watch Officer. Identify. Arthur's voice shifted. It was no longer the voice of a man dealing with a local traffic stop. It was the voice of a commander communicating with headquarters. This is Major General Arthur Harrison. Clearance code Echo Tango 79er Bravo, Arthur said, his enunciation flawless. There was a brief pause on the line as the officer on the other end typed the code into a terminal. Then, the voice snapped to attention, even over the phone. Authentication confirmed. Good evening, General Harrison. How can the command center assist you? I need to be patched through to the home residence of General Robert Hayes, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Arthur said calmly, staring directly into Mitchell Brody's eyes as he spoke. Sergeant Keller's breath hitched in his throat. Brody's smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of profound, creeping confusion. General Hayes is currently off duty, sir. Is this a national security emergency? The watch officer asked. No, Arthur replied, his eyes never leaving Brody. It is a personnel issue. Tell General Hayes that Major General Harrison is currently locked in a holding cell at the Oak Ridge, Virginia Police Department, and I require his immediate assistance in educating the local constabulary on the identification of federal officers. A heavy, stunned silence fell over the phone line. Copy that, General. Patching you through immediately. Please hold. Arthur lowered the phone slightly and looked at the 2 police officers standing on the other side of the iron bars. He's connecting me, Arthur said, a faint, razor-thin smile finally touching the corners of his mouth. Officer Brody, I highly recommend you start thinking about what you are going to say to the Secretary of Defense's boss. In that exact moment, watching the terrifying calm of the man in the cell, Mitchell Brody finally realized that his life, as he knew it, was effectively over. The silence in the holding corridor of the Oak Ridge Police Department was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the ragged, shallow breathing of Officer Mitchell Brody. Through the receiver pressed to Arthur's ear, a distinct click signaled the connection. Arthur? A groggy, gravelly voice echoed through the earpiece. It was General Robert Hayes, a 4-star commander and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's 0200. Are the Russians moving on Kiev, or did you just dial the wrong number? Neither, Bob, Arthur replied, his voice projecting clearly enough for Sergeant Keller and Officer Brody to hear every word. I apologize for waking you. I am currently locked in cell number 3 at the Oak Ridge Police Department in Virginia. I was pulled over for a fabricated traffic violation, accused of stolen valor, and physically assaulted during the arrest. There was a profound, deafening silence on the other end of the line. When General Hayes finally spoke, the grogginess was entirely gone, replaced by the chilling, controlled fury of a man who commanded the most powerful military force on the planet. Are you telling me that a local beat cop handcuffed a 2-star general in the United States Army who currently holds the keys to European logistics? Hayes's voice dropped an octave. Are you injured, Arthur? Bruised wrists. Nothing broken. But the arresting officer, a Mitchell Brody, seems convinced I printed my DOD identification at a local copy shop, Arthur said, his eyes fixed on Brody's increasingly pale face. I need you to verify my identity for the desk sergeant before this situation devolves further. Put him on, Hayes ordered. Put the highest-ranking officer in that pathetic building on the phone right now. Arthur extended his arm through the iron bars, holding the phone out toward Sergeant Keller. He wants to speak to you, Sergeant. Keller's hand shook violently as he reached out and took the phone. He pressed it to his ear. This is Desk Sergeant Thomas Keller. Sergeant Keller, this is General Robert Hayes, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The voice boomed through the receiver with undeniable, terrifying authority. Listen to me very carefully. You currently have a 2-star Major General of the United States Army in your custody. You have unlawfully detained a man with top-secret DARCSCI clearance. I am deploying a liaison team from the Pentagon Force Protection Agency, accompanied by the FBI, to your location immediately. You will not interrogate him. You will not process him. If a single hair on his head is harmed, I will personally see to it that the Department of Justice dismantles your entire precinct, brick by brick. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. General. Yes, sir, Keller stammered, the color completely draining from his face. Unlock that cell, Hayes commanded. Now. Keller practically dropped the phone. He scrambled backward, fumbling wildly with the heavy ring of keys attached to his belt. Brody, still clinging to a desperate, delusional sliver of denial, grabbed Keller's arm. Sarge, what are you doing? It's a prank. He probably called one of his thug friends to play act. Get your hands off me, Brody, Keller roared, shoving the younger officer away with surprising force. That was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Do you have any idea what you've done? You just blew this whole department sky high. Keller jammed the iron key into the cell door and turned it. The heavy lock disengaged with a loud echo. He pulled the door open, practically bowing as he did so. General Harrison, sir. I am so profoundly sorry, Keller whispered, his eyes wide with genuine panic. Please step out. You are not under arrest. Arthur stepped out of the cell slowly. He did not rub his wrists. He did not gloat. He simply adjusted the collar of his OCP uniform and looked at Brody. Brody was visibly trembling now. The arrogant swagger had evaporated, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated terror of a man watching his career crash into a mountain at 1,000 miles an hour. Just then, the heavy double doors leading to the administrative offices flew open. Captain Thomas O'Bannon, the night shift commander, came rushing out, holding a vibrating cell phone. He looked frantic. Keller, what the hell is going on out here? O'Bannon yelled. I just got a call from the mayor. He said the Secretary of Defense just woke him up. O'Bannon's eyes darted around the room and landed on Arthur Harrison, standing in full combat uniform, flanked by an open jail cell. "Oh, sweet Jesus," O'Bannon breathed, the blood rushing from his face. He looked at Brody, who was now backing away slowly, as if trying to melt into the concrete wall. "Brody, tell me you didn't." "He was drifting, Captain," Brody pleaded, his voice cracking, high and desperate. "His tint was too dark. It was a righteous stop." "You arrested a general for a traffic stop?" O'Bannon screamed, spit flying from his lips. "Are you out of your mind?" "He's going to need a lawyer, Captain," Arthur said calmly, his voice a cool breeze cutting through the suffocating heat of the precinct's panic. "And I highly suggest you lock down this building. Your night is about to get very complicated." 45 minutes later, the quiet suburban streets outside the Oak Ridge Police Department were lit up like a runway. Oak Ridge Police Chief Gregory Dawson had arrived 10 minutes prior, wearing suit trousers and a wrinkled undershirt, having been dragged from his bed by a phone call from the governor's office. Dawson was currently in the corner of the booking room, mercilessly tearing into Officer Brody, screaming so loudly that the veins in his neck threatened to burst. Arthur sat quietly on a wooden bench near the front desk. Sergeant Keller had offered him coffee, water, and even the captain's personal leather chair, all of which Arthur had politely declined. He simply sat, waiting. The roar of heavy engines announced the arrival of the federal government. Through the sliding glass doors, 3 black Chevrolet Suburbans with tinted windows violently hopped the curb, parking illegally right on the front walkway of the precinct. Before the vehicles were even fully in park, the doors flew open. 4 men in tactical gear with Federal Protective Service, emblazoned in yellow across their tactical vests, stormed through the front doors, their hands resting cautiously on their holstered sidearms. Behind them walked a tall, sharp-featured man in a crisp charcoal suit. This was FBI Special Agent William Carter, a liaison attached to the Department of Defense. He did not look happy. "Chief Dawson," Carter barked, his voice slicing through the chaotic chatter of the precinct. Chief Dawson abandoned his dressing down of Brody and rushed forward, his face pale and slick with sweat. "I'm Dawson. Agent—" "Carter, Federal Bureau of Investigation," Carter said, flashing a gold shield before bypassing the chief entirely. His eyes locked onto Arthur. Carter immediately snapped perfectly to attention. "General Harrison, sir. Special Agent Carter. The Pentagon sent us to escort you home," Carter said respectfully. "Are you injured, sir?" "I am fine, Agent Carter. Just a bit delayed," Arthur replied, standing up to his full height. Carter turned his attention back to Chief Dawson. The FBI agent's expression was murderous. "Chief, I am initiating an immediate federal investigation into this precinct for civil rights violations, unlawful detention, and interference with a federal officer. I need all body camera footage, dash camera footage, and radio logs from the last 3 hours surrendered to my team immediately." "Of course, Agent Carter. Absolutely," Dawson stammered, nodding furiously. "This was a catastrophic mistake by a rogue officer. We are fully cooperating." "Who made the arrest?" Carter demanded. Dawson pointed a trembling finger at Mitchell Brody. Brody looked physically ill. He was leaning against the concrete wall, looking at the tactical officers, the FBI agent, and the general he had abused. The realization of his absolute insignificance had finally shattered his ego. "Officer Brody," Chief Dawson said, his voice dripping with disgust. "Hand over your badge and your service weapon. Right now, you are stripped of your police powers, suspended without pay, pending termination, and federal indictment." Brody's hands shook as he unbuckled his duty belt. The heavy leather hit the linoleum floor with a dull, depressing thud. He unpinned the silver badge from his chest, leaving a torn hole in the fabric of his uniform, and placed it on the front desk. He looked at Arthur, his eyes pleading, looking for some ounce of mercy. "General, I was just doing my job. I thought—" "You thought your badge was a license to execute your prejudices, Mr. Brody," Arthur interrupted, his voice devoid of anger, operating purely on clinical fact. "You saw a black man in a nice car, and you constructed a narrative to justify your hostility. You didn't do your job. You shamed your uniform, and now you will face the consequences of the law you swore to uphold." Arthur turned away from the disgraced cop. He looked at Officer Liam Higgins, who had been standing silently in the corner, looking utterly traumatized by the night's events. "Officer Higgins," Arthur called out. Higgins jumped, snapping to attention. Yes, sir." "You knew this stop was wrong. I saw it in your eyes. But you allowed fear of your partner to override your duty," Arthur said softly. "Learn from this night. If you cannot stand up to a bully in your own patrol car, you have no business policing the streets." Higgins swallowed hard, tears welling in his eyes. "Yes, sir. I understand, sir." "Agent Carter," Arthur said, turning back to the FBI liaison. "I believe I am ready to go home. My wife is likely wondering why I am late for dinner." "Right this way, General," Carter said, gesturing toward the open glass doors. As Major General Arthur Harrison walked out of the Oak Ridge Police Department, flanked by federal agents and heavily armed security, the silence in the room was suffocating. Chief Dawson held his head in his hands. Sergeant Keller stared blankly at his computer screen. And Mitchell Brody, a man who had built his entire identity on bullying the powerless, stood shivering in the corner, realizing he had just picked a fight with the United States military and lost everything. The morning after the arrest, the sun rose over Oak Ridge, but for Mitchell Brody, the world had gone entirely dark. By 7 a.m., the incident was no longer a localized precinct catastrophe. It was a national scandal. Officer Liam Higgins, terrified of being indicted alongside his former training officer, had immediately contacted the FBI tip line and handed over a copy of the cruiser's dashcam and interior audio recordings before Chief Dawson could even think about burying the evidence. By 9 a.m., the Washington Post ran the digital headline, "Local Police Assault 2-Star General in Egregious Profiling Incident." By noon, the dash-cam footage was playing on a continuous loop across every major cable news network in the country. The public watched in sheer disbelief as a smirking, arrogant beat cop manhandled one of the highest-ranking logistics commanders in the United States Army. The bureaucratic wrath of the federal government is a terrifying machine, and once it is turned on, it cannot be stopped. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division descended upon the Oak Ridge Police Department like a swarm of locusts. Brody sat at the kitchen table of his modest, heavily mortgaged, split-level home, staring blankly at the television. His phone had not stopped ringing for 4 hours. First, it was his union representative, who curtly informed him that the Fraternal Order of Police would not be providing legal counsel. The footage was too damning, the political pressure too immense. They were cutting him loose to save the rest of the department. Then came the knock on the door. Brody peeked through the blinds. On his front porch stood 2 stern-faced men wearing windbreakers with FBI printed on the back. Brody's stomach violently evacuated whatever contents it held. He opened the door, his hands trembling. "Mitchell Brody?" the lead agent asked, not waiting for a confirmation. "I am Special Agent Thomas Reed. We have a federal warrant for your arrest under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." The irony was not lost on Brody, as cold steel ratcheted around his own wrists. But unlike General Harrison, Brody did not stand tall. He wept. He sobbed openly, as his neighbors, the same neighbors he used to boast to about his elite law enforcement status, stood on their lawns, recording his perp walk with their smartphones. The twists of karma, however, were just beginning to unravel Brody's life. In his desperate attempt to find legal representation, Brody reached out to a partner at Williams & Connolly, one of the most prestigious defense firms in Washington, D.C. The receptionist took his name, placed him on a brief hold, and returned only to politely inform him that the firm didn't represent individuals accused of civil rights violations against active duty flag officers. He was toxic, unrepresented, and unable to afford private counsel. Brody was assigned a deeply overworked public defender who took one look at the dashcam footage and advised him to plead guilty immediately. But the hardest hit came from inside his own home. Brody's wife, Sarah, had spent years turning a blind eye to his casual cruelty and inflated ego. But the public humiliation was too much. The FBI had seized their computers and financial records during the raid. In doing so, they uncovered a devastating secret Brody had kept hidden. He was over $80,000 in credit card debt, funding a lifestyle he couldn't afford just to project an image of superiority. The man who had sneered at Arthur Harrison's classic Chevelle, accusing the general of being a fraud, was the ultimate imposter himself. Within 48 hours of his arrest, Sarah packed her bags, took their dog, and moved into her sister's house, leaving divorce papers on the kitchen counter. Brody was left entirely alone, sitting in a county jail cell, denied bail because the federal magistrate deemed him a flight risk due to his impending financial ruin. Meanwhile, at the Pentagon, Major General Arthur Harrison went back to work. He sat in the Situation Room, reviewing troop deployments and supply chain logistics for NATO forces. When colleagues gingerly asked how he was doing after the viral incident, Arthur simply adjusted his glasses and replied, "The system is correcting an error. Our focus is on Eastern Europe." He refused to give Mitchell Brody another ounce of his mental energy. 6 months later, the media circus had finally funneled into the quiet, wood-paneled solemnity of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia. Mitchell Brody sat at the defense table. He was unrecognizable. The arrogant swagger, the flushed, aggressive complexion, the puffed-out chest, all of it was gone. He had lost 20 pounds. He wore a standard-issue green prison jumpsuit, his shoulders slumped, his eyes permanently fixed on the polished mahogany table in front of him. Presiding over the case was Judge Leonie Brinkema, a veteran federal judge known for her razor-sharp intellect and absolute intolerance for government corruption. She looked down at Brody from the bench with an expression of icy disdain. The courtroom was packed. Behind the prosecution sat Chief Dawson, who had been forced into early retirement. To his left sat Officer Liam Higgins, who had avoided federal charges by testifying against his former partner, but had ultimately resigned from law enforcement, deeply disillusioned by what he had witnessed. And in the front row of the gallery sat Major General Arthur Harrison. He was in his Class A dress uniform, a chest full of ribbons reflecting decades of honorable, grueling service to his country. He sat with perfect, immovable posture. "Mr. Brody," Judge Brinkema's voice cut through the silence of the courtroom. "You have pleaded guilty to 1 count of deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal felony. Before I hand down your sentence, does the victim in this case wish to make a statement?" The federal prosecutor stood up. "Yes, Your Honor. General Harrison has prepared a brief statement." Arthur stood. He did not walk to the podium. He simply stood at his seat in the front row, his deep, resonant baritone filling the room without the need for a microphone. Brody flinched at the sound of the voice, slowly raising his head to look at the man he had once called boy. "Your Honor," Arthur began, his tone entirely devoid of vengeance, radiating only a clinical, devastating truth. When a soldier puts on a uniform, they accept that they may have to sacrifice their life to defend the Constitution of the United States. We endure this burden so that the citizens of this country can live freely, safely, and equally under the law. Arthur paused, his dark eyes locking onto Brody's pale, trembling face. On the night of July 14th, Mitchell Brody used the authority granted to him by that very same Constitution to terrorize a citizen based solely on his own unchecked prejudices. He did not see a man. He did not see a general. He saw a target for his own deep-seated inadequacies. Arthur took a slow breath. I do not stand here out of a desire for revenge. Mr. Brody's own actions have already cost him his career, his family, and his freedom. My concern is for the badge he wore. The badge is a symbol of public trust. When men like Mr. Brody use it as a weapon of intimidation, they damage the fabric of our society in ways that take generations to repair. I ask the court to impose a sentence that reminds every law enforcement officer in this nation that the law is a shield for the innocent, not a sword for the arrogant. Arthur sat down. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the court reporter had paused for a fraction of a second. Judge Brinkema adjusted her glasses. She looked from Arthur to the broken man sitting at the defense table. General Harrison, thank you for your service and for your profound dignity in the face of such grotesque behavior, Judge Brinkema said. Then she turned her full, terrifying attention to Brody. Mitchell Brody, I have reviewed the dashcam footage of your actions. I watched you mock, physically assault, and unlawfully detain a decorated flag officer of the United States military. Your behavior was not a mistake. It was a deliberate, predatory exhibition of malice. You operated under the delusion that your badge made you untouchable. Brody began to weep again, his hands shaking so violently, the handcuffs holding his wrists together clinked loudly against the wooden table. The irony, Mr. Brody, is that the very federal government you mockingly accused General Harrison of defrauding is the one currently holding you to account, the judge continued, her voice rising in volume. You betrayed your oath. You betrayed your community, and you will pay the price for that betrayal. Judge Brinkema picked up her gavel. Mitchell Brody, I sentence you to 48 months in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, to be followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are permanently barred from holding any position in law enforcement, security, or public office at the local, state, or federal level. The gavel slammed down with the finality of a coffin closing. Bang! Federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing Brody by his arms. As they pulled him to his feet to drag him out of the courtroom, Brody looked back over his shoulder one last time. He saw Major General Arthur Harrison calmly standing up, adjusting his uniform, and walking out of the courtroom doors to return to the Pentagon. Brody had promised Arthur that he was going away to a federal penitentiary. It was the only correct prediction the disgraced officer had made that entire night. Karma, it turned out, possessed a perfect sense of direction. What began as a routine power trip for a corrupt cop ended in the total destruction of his life and career, proving that arrogant prejudice is no match for quiet, disciplined authority. General Harrison's terrifyingly calm response wasn't just a masterclass in emotional control. It was the ultimate trap for a bully blinded by his own ego. Karma doesn't always act instantly, but when it does, it hits with the force of a 4-star command. If you loved this incredible true-to-life story of instant karma, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to the channel for more.